Hello, my name is Lori Cohen. I am the Director of Continuing Education at Gratz College. Thank you for joining us. This evening, Dr. Paul Finkelman, President of Gratz College, will take a historical look at the seeds of racial inequality in America. Our next webinar will be Wednesday, August 12th. During that presentation, Gratz alumnus Jerry Silverman will offer a fun and insightful look at Jewish gematria. This presentation will explore the surprising links between Judaism and math. Registration information will be sent to your email this evening. I also want to remind everyone that there are still a couple of open continuing education classes in Gratz's summer schedule. In addition, I must mention that our Schusterman Distinguished Scholar Lecture is taking place right here on Zoom on Wednesday, September 30th. Liz Spicol, editor of the Jewish Exponent, will interview Pamela Nadel, author of the book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today. This conversation will ask, what does it mean to be a Jewish woman in America? In her book, Nadel weaves together the stories of women such as Grace Nathan, Emma Lazarus, Bessie Hillman, and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as she describes how these women left deep footprints in the history of the nation they call home. This book is also available for purchase through Gratz College. So great news, we have over 130 people registered for this program tonight. Due to the size of the group, we have muted all of your audio and turned off your video. You are able to see and hear the speaker, me at the moment, but no one can see or hear you. Questions will wait until the end. To ask a question, please type it inside the chat function. This can be found in different locations of your screen, depending on the type of media you are using. On desktop computers or laptops, it can be found at the bottom of your screen. You have to move your mouse down there for a black bar to show up. On tablets, it's often at the top of the screen. And on cell phones, you may have to swipe left or right. We are recording this session right now. We will send you a link to the recording after it has been processed and edited. You'll also receive an online survey soon after the presentation ends. We appreciate your input as it helps us improve your experience for future webinars. Today's program with Gratz College President Dr. Paul Finkelman is a timely one. With race relations in the forefront of our news cycle, it's an especially prescient time to pause and examine the history of our nation. I can think of no better person to guide us than Gratz's president, a historian, whose work has a special emphasis on slavery and race relations. You may not know that in 2017, Dr. Finkelman held the Fulbright Chair in Human Rights and Social Justice at the University of Ottawa's School of Law, and that he recently published a book entitled Supreme Injustice, Slavery in the Nation's Highest Court. Welcome, Paul. Are you out there?
I am out here. Thank you. It's a delight to be here. And thank you all for coming. Lori, before I continue any further though, I cannot see myself on this screen. Is there a way to do that?
I think that we will ask our technical support who is on here as well to do that.
Because I want to make sure that people can see me and that my screen hasn't been tilted in such a way that I'm not clear. But in any way, while you're figuring that out, let me start. And the first thing I want to do is, some of you may notice I'm wearing a black t-shirt, but it's actually a t-shirt that I hope some of you can see where it says Forever Free. This is from the monument and museum to the United States colored troops who fought in the Civil War. During the Civil War, the American Army initially was completely segregated, with no blacks being allowed to fight. And later, blacks were allowed to fight, but they fought in segregated units known as USCT regiments. So I'm wearing their t-shirt because it seemed appropriate for the program tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Finkelman. I just want to let you know that we can all see you just fine.
Right, but I can't see me. I guess that's okay. That's just the way it is.
Well, you look great.
Pardon?
You look great.
Well, that's wonderful to know. Oh, there I am. Okay, I figured out how to find myself. It's always useful. So let me start with the group of pictures that you see in front of you. They're, of course, very famous African Americans. Frederick Douglass is on the left. This is an older Frederick Douglass, probably from the 1880s or 1890s. Frederick Douglass died in 1895. He was born in 1818, so he lived a long, full life. Next to him is Ida Wells Brown Barnett, who was the leading opponent of lynching in America at the turn of the 20th century. And she was a strong social advocate. Next to her, of course, is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, the civil rights activist and leader and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. And next to him is Thurgood Marshall, the first Black to serve on the US Supreme Court. But if we could kind of conjure up Justice Marshall and say, how would you like to be remembered? He would probably say, as he often did, that he wanted to be remembered as the leading civil rights lawyer from the late 1930s until the 1960s when he first went on the bench. He was the man who organized the litigation in Brown v. Board of Education and much of the other very important civil rights litigation of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and into the early 60s. So now if I can go from there, I would go to slide 1. And here you see the United States in 1789. You'll note that most of the states are pink, but that 4 of them, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, 5 of them, I wish I could count, are in blue. You'll also notice that Maine is part of Massachusetts at this time. The difference between these 5 and the remaining 8 states is that in these states, slavery had been either completely abolished, that is, it was abolished in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 and in the New Hampshire Constitution of 1783, or the states had passed what are called gradual abolition acts, which were laws which stated that no new slaves could be born in these states, no slaves could be imported into these states, and all children born to slaves would be born free. Pennsylvania in 1780 is the first state to pass such a law, and it is in fact, as far as I've been able to determine, the first time literally in the history of the world that a legislature passed a law to end slavery somewhere in the world. And before we continue on with the narrative, I just want to kind of take a pause. If this were a book, this would be a footnote, but it's a footnote worth taking note of. And that is that at the time of the European movement to America, starting with Columbus in 1492 and continuing through the 1600s, slavery is found everywhere that there is human habitation, with the exception of what is today Australia, the Inuit or Eskimo people in the Arctic Circle, and in a few places where slavery had simply died out, but had previously existed. The Mediterranean basin, North Africa, Europe, is a giant market and world of slavery. Slaves come from all ethnic groups, they come from all racial groups, they come from all religious groups. It is true that most communities enslave outsiders, but at the same time, in all communities, people from within those communities are held as slaves as well. So that in ancient Rome, there were slaves from all over the Roman Empire, but there were also Italian slaves in ancient Rome. There were Greek slaves in ancient Greek. There were Hebrew slaves in ancient Judea. And in the post-Roman world, there's slavery everywhere in Europe. Indeed, the word slave comes from the word Slav, because in the very early medieval period, starting around 900, the biggest source of slaves in the Mediterranean were people from the Slavic regions of Europe, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Ukraine. And slaves in these areas were brought either by ships, usually by Vikings, or overland by slave traders who would march them down from Ukraine into what is today Greece or Italy, or the many countries that once made up Yugoslavia, into France, into Spain. So when Europeans come to the New World, it's not surprising that they bring slavery with them, because slavery is found all over Spain and Portugal, which are the first two countries to settle the New World. They also discover, of course, that the Aztec owned slaves in Mexico, the Inca owned slaves in Peru, and in various other parts of the New World, native peoples owned slaves as well. What makes America different is that very quickly America becomes a region, two continents, both of the Americas, where slavery is racially based. And this is actually the first time in the history of the world that you would find a slave system that is based on race. So now let's fast forward to 1789. When the revolution begins, slavery is legal in every state. 1775, 76, all of these states have slavery. But as we see, by 1789, which is when the Constitution goes into effect, there are a few places, 5 states, where slavery has either been abolished or is dying out. In addition, Vermont, which is not yet a state, but is a region claimed by both New Hampshire and New York, but later becomes a state. People in Vermont have written a constitution where slavery is over. And Congress has passed an ordinance, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which prohibits slavery north and west of the Ohio River. The rest of the Southwest, what is today Alabama and Mississippi, what is today Tennessee and Kentucky, are claimed in some ways by Georgia and North Carolina, but they're really territories by 1789. Slavery, of course, is found there as well. So that is the beginning of the United States. It begins as a slave society. So now let me have slide 2. And the 3/5 clause is one of the clauses that is found in the US Constitution that deals with slavery. And what I would like to do for the next couple of minutes is talk about the way in which the US Constitution, in fact, protects and supports slavery. And part of the reason why I want to focus on this today is because of the current debate in the United States over monuments, over history, over race relations, and the claims of many people that we need to rethink how we teach history, how we view our own history. So if we flash to 1789, go back to the first slide for just 1 second. So if we flash to the Constitutional Convention, which is 1787, and we have delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island never bothers to send anybody, we would note that of the delegates from 12 states, 8 come from states where slavery is still in place, and 4 come from states which have either ended slavery or in the process of doing so. Southerners at the convention insist on particular protections for slavery built into the Constitution. It is the only form of private property that has constitutional protection. It's the only social institution that is written into the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution about marriage, about raising children, about families, about owning your own home. None of these things matter in the Constitution, but slavery is written in a variety of ways. So now let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to take you through some of the clauses of the Constitution that deal with slavery. The first big debate at the convention is whether you count slaves for purposes of representation. The Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, the government that existed before the Constitution, consisted of one vote for each state. The states could send more than one representative to Congress. And in fact, it had to have two to vote on a bill, but you only got one vote per state. That had to change. It had to change because there were states with very large populations like Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and there were states with tiny little populations like Delaware, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. And the large states said, we have to have representation based on population. The Southerners said, you have to count slaves for representation. The Northerners said, how dare you count slaves in a nation built for free people? We're creating a republic based on the rights of man. How can we have a Congress where slavery is somehow represented? Eventually, the compromise is reached. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. It's hard to imagine designing a clause which is more difficult to understand. And this was part of what the delegates wanted to do. They did not want the general public to understand just how powerful slavery was going to be as an institution within the United States. So instead of mentioning slaves, they refer to 3/5 of other persons. The other persons are, of course, slaves. Now, this is not racially based in the sense that it doesn't say 3/5 of Black people. Rather, it says 3/5 of slaves. One of the ironies of this is that when the Civil War ends, the South actually gets an increase in the number of votes it has in Congress because the 3/5 are now 5/5 because the former slaves are, as my t-shirt says, forever free. And once they are forever free, they are counted fully for purposes of representation. The direct taxes part, everybody understood that would probably never happen, and it never in fact did happen. One of the kind of funny moments of the Constitutional Convention from our perspective is that a delegate from Pennsylvania named Gouverneur Morris says the 3/5 taxes will never be used because it's impossible to imagine that the government would ever be able to reach directly into our pockets and take our money. Well, now the government still doesn't do that. It takes the money before the money even gets to our pockets through withholding taxes. But the 3/5 clause in terms of politics is dramatically important. On close votes involving issues of slavery and freedom, the South has far more power in the House of Representatives and always has to get some Northerners to go along with them, but has to get far fewer Northerners because of the many representatives that they get by counting slaves. Let me get to the next clause. Among the many powers of Congress is this clause. Congress shall have the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the United States, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Well, we know what executing the laws are, and we know what repelling invasions are. Insurrections, every Southerner understood what an insurrection was. It was a slave rebellion. When you were in high school or college, you were probably told that this clause had to do with something called Shays' Rebellion, which was a taxpayers' revolt in Massachusetts. And certainly some of the delegates had that in mind. But when Southern delegates returned from the Constitutional Convention to their own states, they pointed to this clause over and over again to say, look at what we got. We now have a promise that the national government will call out the militias, not only our militias, but other state militias if necessary, to suppress slave rebellions. Next slide, please. The issue of the slave trade took up a number of days of debate at the Constitutional Convention. In 1787, none of the states actually imported slaves from Africa. During the Revolution, the slave trade had been banned by every one of the new states. And this was in part because the slave trade was almost an entirely British operation. And so banning the slave trade also meant not trading with England, which was the enemy during the Revolution. After the Revolution, none of the slave states reopened the African slave trade, but South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina expected that they would reopen the slave trade at some point. And as a result, these delegates from those states insisted on a clause to protect their right to import slaves. Again, if you look at a textbook, if you touched on this in college or in high school, it was always presented to me as saying that the Constitution said we had to end the slave trade in 1808. But if we read the language, it doesn't say that. It says the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited before 1808. It doesn't say it has to be permitted. Notice again the refusal to actually say what they're talking about. It doesn't say the importation of slaves. By the way, during one of the heated debates in this, again, the delegate from Pennsylvania, Gouverneur Morris, said, let's just call it what it is. Let's say in the Constitution, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina can import slaves until 1808. But of course, nobody wanted to use the word slave, and nobody wanted to single out any other states. In 1803, South Carolina and Georgia both reopened the trade, and at least 60,000 slaves are brought into the United States between 1803 and 1808. It's the largest number of imported Africans of any 5-year period in the history of the United States. After 1808, it becomes illegal to import slaves, and eventually slave trading is declared to be piracy, which could be punished by death if you were illegally importing slaves. However, there's always people who break the law, and there was a small amount of smuggling of slaves into the United States up until the Civil War starts. Next slide, please. So, the Electoral College. We talk about it a lot today. We all worry about what does it mean to elect a president when the person who wins the popular vote doesn't win the election. It's happened twice in our lifetime. It's happened 5 or 6 times in the history of the United States. Where does the Electoral College come from? During the debate over how to elect the president, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, says that the most appropriate thing would be for the people to elect the president. And then he said, but we can't do that. And he says, because in the debate, he says, our Negroes would have no influence over the election. What he means by that, of course, is the slaves don't vote. So if you have a popular election of the president, the power, the political value of slaves won't be counted. So instead, he comes up with the Electoral College. How does the Electoral College work? Every state gets an elector based on the number of representatives in Congress it has, plus its 2 senators. The end result is that the southern states get a significant number of presidential electors who are there only because slaves are counted for representation. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson, who owns about 150 slaves at the time, including a number of his own children, he would not have been elected president if there had not been an electoral college. The popular vote would have gone to John Adams. If the electoral college had only been based on free people, Jefferson would not have been elected president. So this really does matter. And of course, it is a system that is weirdly still with us today. And we become the only democracy in the world where the person who wins the most votes might not get elected president. Could I have the next slide? Southerners also worried that their slaves would run away. Nobody likes being a slave. They demand some protection against slaves running away and becoming free. And again, the convention writes this clause, which is obscure and obfuscates the issue. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into the other, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up. Who is a person who owes service or labor? A slave. They don't want to say the word slave. They have a debate over this, actually. And a number of the delegates from the North say, we don't want to use the word slave because if we do, some of our constituents might not support the Constitution. In essence, the founders are trying to hide from the American people what it is that they're asking the American people to support. Oddly, during the debates over the Constitution, there is not a single Northerner who says anything about this clause. This is so obscure and so far back into the Constitution. It's in Article 4. People can read that far into the Constitution that people don't really know what it is. People talk about the Federalist Papers, which were written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay for the purpose of convincing people to support the Constitution. Federalist Papers say not a word about this clause because the Federalist Papers are designed to get New Yorkers to support the Constitution. Even though New York still has slavery, most New Yorkers oppose slavery by this time. But in the South, supporters of the Constitution point to this clause often to show that slavery is safe under the Constitution. And so it is. The most important protection from slavery is not one which even mentions it in any way. It's the clause which says that to amend the Constitution, you have to have 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the states. Getting 2/3 of the Congress would be almost impossible given that half the states are slave states, half the Senate is therefore pro-slavery, and the 3/5 clause. But even if you could get 2/3 of the Congress, you couldn't get 3/4 of the states. The math is pretty simple. In 1860, there were 15 slave states. If those states had not seceded, if they had remained in the United States, to this day, in 2020, you would not be able to pass an amendment to end slavery because the 15 slave states could outvote the 35 free states. You would need 45 free states, a nation of 60 states, to have a 3/4 majority to pass a constitutional amendment. So now let's go to the next slide. And here we see some people we all recognize. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Tyler, Polk, Taylor. What do they have in common? Every single one of them is a slave owner. They own many slaves. None of these men are what we would call small-time slave owners. Jefferson owns probably 150 slaves. Washington, when he becomes president, owns at least that many. When I went to college, one of my teachers was a biographer of James Madison, a big fan of James Madison. He always said what a kind, humane individual Madison was. And when I asked him about slave owning, he said, oh, he didn't own very many. Madison wasn't rich like his neighbor Jefferson. No, Madison wasn't as rich as his neighbor Jefferson. Madison only owned 100 slaves. So Jefferson owned maybe 150. So Jefferson was 50% richer than Madison. But Madison is an enormously wealthy man. 100 slaves today would make him a billionaire. Not a millionaire, a billionaire. He owns at least that many. Monroe owns in the 40s or 50s. Jackson owns in the 40s or 50s. Tyler owns a substantial number. Polk owns a substantial number. Zachary Taylor, in the year that he's elected president, buys another plantation. He already owns one. He buys another plantation with more than 50 slaves on it as he goes into the White House. So of the first 15 presidents leading up to the Civil War, 8 of them are Southern slave owners. But if you remember the old ads on TV for Vegematic, where the ad would always end, but wait, there's more. Well, our next slide will give us more. So here are 3 Northerners: Martin Van Buren from New York, William Henry Harrison from Ohio, James Buchanan, the only president from Pennsylvania. What do they have in common? They had all owned slaves at one point in their life. Van Buren was born in New York when slavery was legal, and when he is an adult and a young lawyer, he buys a couple of slaves. When he's growing up in New York in the colonial period and after the Revolution, his family owns slaves. William Henry Harrison is originally from Virginia. He comes from a very, very wealthy family. His family owns hundreds of slaves. And when he moves to Ohio to become the territorial governor, he brings slaves with him, and he petitions Congress to have an amendment to the Northwest Ordinance that will allow people moving into Ohio to bring slaves with them. Fortunately, Congress never acts on that petition. James Buchanan grows up in a slaveholding family in Pennsylvania. Again, while Pennsylvania passes its Gradual Abolition Act in 1780, existing slaves will remain slaves until either they're freed or they die. Buchanan is born before the 1780 Act. His family owned slaves. And as late as the 1820s, James Buchanan is selling a slave that he inherited from his father when his father died. So now, our next slide. John Quincy Adams. They did not own slaves. They hated slavery. John Adams is the man who wrote the clause in the 1780 Constitution in Massachusetts to end slavery. And John Quincy Adams, after he left the presidency, became a forceful advocate against slavery. One more slide. Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, both from New York, both from the North. Fillmore from New York, Pierce from New Hampshire. Neither owned slaves, but they were pro-slavery Northerners. And they were pro-slavery Northerners because they believed correctly that to get anything done, they needed to have the support of the Deep South. And so they supported slavery at every turn. Fillmore signed the horrible Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Pierce tried to make Kansas into a slave state. Next slide. So here we have 2 Jewish senators from the South who owned slaves. Interestingly, the first US senators who were Jewish were from the South, not from the North. And there is not a Northern senator who was Jewish until the late 19th century. But David Yulee is the first senator from Florida. Judah Benjamin is a senator from Louisiana. Benjamin owns more than 100 slaves on a plantation in Louisiana. Not a pretty picture if you're concerned about American Jewish history, but a reality that we have to come to terms with. In the current movement to remove slaveholders from places of honor, there have been a couple of synagogues in the United States that have taken down references to Judah P. Benjamin as a famous Jewish American. Benjamin would serve in the Confederate government, and that is a, I'm getting a text from somebody saying, isn't that actually Jefferson Davis on the left? And now that I look at it, I think it may be somehow a strange photograph got in here instead of David Yulee. Thank you for asking that question. So forget about the picture. It's the person's name is the one that we need to be focusing on. Benjamin served in the Confederate cabinet and then escaped from the United States and went to England after the war. Next slide. So, Abraham Lincoln. He is Southern born, like most of our early presidents, born in Kentucky. His family leaves Kentucky because they don't like slavery, and they move to Indiana. He later moves to Illinois. Lincoln, of course, is deeply against slavery as an individual, and his administration is an administration that alters civil rights in the United States in very fundamental ways. Under Lincoln, slavery is abolished, first in the District of Columbia, then in the federal territories. Then Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that slaves in the Confederate States will be forever free. And even before he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, he also signs a law which says that blacks can be enlisted in the United States Army, and those who are enlisted will be forever free. And so not only will they be forever free, but their wives and their children will be forever free. So Lincoln is an emancipator in lots of ways. He also signs legislation to prohibit segregation on streetcars in Washington, D.C., and in various other ways to enhance civil rights in the United States. So I'm going to pause for a moment to just say that when we think about American history, it is important to understand the place that slavery overwhelmingly has in the development of the United States. Lincoln is assassinated and is replaced, as we see in the next slide, by Andrew Johnson, who is a slave owner when he becomes a US Senator and only gives up slave owning during the Civil War. And he is replaced by Ulysses Grant, who oddly enough owned one slave in his life as well. And Grant's slave owning illustrates the way in which slavery and the racial ideology that created crept into everything, whether you wanted it to or not. Ulysses Grant, as a young man, marries his sweetheart, a woman he meets when he is stationed in St. Louis at Jefferson Barracks, a woman named Julia Dent. As a wedding present, Julia's father gives the Grant family a slave as a wedding present. Grant is a young lieutenant. He doesn't have a lot of money, and he owns this slave. He is then sent off to serve in San Francisco. He serves all over the West. The slave stays in St. Louis with Julia. Finally, when Grant leaves the military, he moves to Illinois and he emancipates this one slave. That is, he frees him, lets him be free for the rest of his life. And at the time that Grant does this, Grant is almost bankrupt. He is desperately short of money. He could have sold the slave and solved some of his financial problems. But Grant finds slavery absolutely intolerable, and he cannot sell a human being, and so he frees the one slave that he owns. Later, during the Civil War, Grant, of course, is the commander of the U.S. Army, and in a number of ways, he insists on certain amounts of equal treatment for Black soldiers, and he insists on enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation. So that during the war, the Confederacy says that it will not engage in prisoner exchanges of Black troops, that if Black soldiers are captured, they will not be exchanged for white Confederate soldiers, because the South says it's illegal to use Black soldiers at all. Grant says, fine, if you won't exchange all American prisoners, then there'll be no prisoner exchanges. And as a result, in the last year and a half of the war, there are no prisoner exchanges because the South refuses to exchange Black prisoners that are captured by the Confederacy. At the same time, Grant hears that some captured Black soldiers are being enslaved, and he sends a message to his counterparts in the Confederacy saying that if you turn former US soldiers into slaves by enslaving captured Black soldiers, I will shoot one Confederate prisoner of war for every person who you enslave, because enslaving captured prisoners is a violation of the laws of war. The South backs off from enslaving Black prisoners. Towards the very end of the war, the Confederacy is willing to throw in the towel. And the only condition that they really put forward is you have to not enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. If you'll not enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, let us keep our slaves, we'll end the war. And Grant insists that this cannot be done, that we must push forward, finish the war, and end slavery. As president, he does everything in his power to crush the Ku Klux Klan and in many ways to enhance Black rights in the post-Civil War South. So now I want to go to the next slide, which takes us back to 1789. And the only reason I'm doing this is to take you through a very quick map history of the United States in terms of slavery and race. So this is the United States on the eve of the Constitution going into effect. Next slide. Here we have the United States in 1850. You can see the 15 free states in orange in the north. You can see the 15 slave states in the south. While there are equal number of slave states, it's quite clear that the South occupies far more territory. Slavery has grown, slavery has increased. There are people who like to argue that the trajectory of the United States after the Constitution was to eventually end slavery. But in fact, what we see is Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, and Texas, all new slave states coming into the Union. Now we go to the next map. And here we see the secession of the slave states. We also note that four southern states plus a large portion of Virginia do not secede. So there are slave states in the United States when the Civil War is fought: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And then there is West Virginia, which ends slavery when it enters the Union in 1863. By this time, of course, 4 new northern states have also entered the Union: California, Oregon, Minnesota, and then Kansas. But if you look at this map carefully, you see all these other territories: New Mexico Territory, Utah, Colorado, Nebraska, Dakota, Indian Territory, Washington Territory, Nevada Territory. Under the Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott in 1857, all of these territories became open to slavery. So if there's no secession and no civil war, the possibility is very likely that slavery will grow. Slavery is deeply embedded in the Indian Territory. It's embedded in New Mexico Territory, and there are slaves in the Utah Territory at the time that secession takes place. Now, I'm going to move away from this old history to talk about the 20th century. But go back to my map, please, for a second. But before I do, I want you to think about this map for a moment in this way. Think about all of the states that are in red, which is the Confederacy. Add to those states all the states with the purple stripes, and add to them the Indian Territory, which becomes Oklahoma. Tucked in there, by the way, is the District of Columbia. Because in these 17 states, the 15 slave states in 1860, plus West Virginia and Oklahoma, you have rigorous statewide mandatory segregation of everything by the year 1900. And when I mean everything, it is impossible to find any sort of place where blacks and whites might meet on any level of interaction or equality. The only time blacks and whites will meet in these 17 states is when blacks are in a subordinate position to whites. All schools are segregated. All hospitals are segregated. My favorite, in an ironic way, I say favorite only because it just shows how absurd it is. A number of states in the late 19th and early 20th century create schools for the blind. Schools for the blind are segregated, just in case somehow somebody got over their blindness, they wouldn't discover that as a white person, they were in a school with black people. In Florida, at the end of the school year, the textbooks from the black schools are housed in one building. The textbooks from the white schools are housed in another building. In Louisiana, there's a law which says not only must blacks and whites sit separately if they go to the same circus. So if you have a circus tent, you have to have a black section and a white section. But in addition to that, they have to be separate ticket lines. In the 1930s, South Carolina begins to have industry. One industry South Carolina has is cotton mills. And South Carolina passes a law which says that if you have a cotton factory, a place where you turn cotton fiber into cloth, black and white workers can't work in the same rooms together. They can't share the same stairways together. They can't get their pay at the same time at the pay window. In those days, you got your pay every week in an envelope with cash in it. And of course, drinking fountains, toilets, etc., are completely segregated. Oklahoma segregates everything possible, including fishing lakes, so that blacks and whites can't fish on the same lake. But then oddly passes a law which says that when blacks and whites work together in mines underground, they can work next to each other. You don't have to have a separate mine for black people, a separate mine for white people. But as soon as they get back to the surface and there's a shower to shower off the coal dust or any other dirt on them, there have to be separate showers for blacks and whites. So the United States has a region, approximately a quarter of the country, well, actually in terms of states, a third of the country, where segregation is rigidly enforced. In the rest of the country, there are some segregation laws. Usually they are local. You may remember that in the famous school desegregation case, Kansas is the, the first state to be sued, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Topeka is actually one of the few places in Kansas where there is segregation in the schools, and so that's why it's chosen. So this is the world that emerges from the end of Ulysses Grant's administration up through the 20th century. Now we can go to the next slide. In 1909, an organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is formed. It is a civil rights organization designed to end and fight segregation. This is a photograph of some of the 6 founders on it. You'll note Ida Wells Barnett, who was on the first page of this program, is there. Next to her is W.B. Du Bois, who was the first Black to get a PhD in history from Harvard University. Next to him is Henry Moskowitz and 3 others who are civil rights advocates. Oswald Garrison Villard is a descendant of the famous abolitionist from the 1830s and 40s and 50s, William Lloyd Garrison. Next page. Among the founders are an extraordinarily large number of Jewish Americans. There's, in the upper left is Joel Spingarn. Joel Spingarn is actually the first chairman of the NAACP, and the highest award that the NAACP gives to this day is the Spingarn Medal. This is the Nobel Prize of Civil Rights in the United States. Both Joel Spingarn and his brother, who's on the other side of this picture, Arthur Spingarn, are founders, along with Lillian Wald, Joseph Billenkoff, Rabbi Stephen Wise, and can you pull the slide down a little so we can see the names of the other 3 at the bottom? They're not showing up on my screen.
I believe they should be showing up. I don't know if that's anyone else's issue.
Well, it's not showing up on my screen, so you can read them off for me.
The bottom row, the bottom left is Julius Rosenwald. Then we have Jacob Schiff, Emil Hirsch, and Henry Moskowitz.
Okay, so we saw Henry Moskowitz before. Emil Schiff Emil Hirsch, of course, is a rabbi. Jacob Schiff is a Jewish philanthropist, as is Julius Rosenwald. And there's a Philadelphia connection to the Rosenwalds because his son Lessing Rosenwald moves to Philadelphia and is a member of Reform Congregation Knesset Israel. And there is I believe there's an art gallery near here named that's on the grounds of the Rosenwald estate. In addition, on the right, there are 2 major civil rights lawyers in this period. The first is Arthur Garfield Hayes. It should actually be a Hayes without an D-E, H-A-Y-S.
Apologize very much. While we're at it, would you mind just adjusting your camera a little?
Yeah, I'm sorry. No problem.
Thank you.
Anyways, when I first encountered Arthur Garfield Hayes, I assumed he was a traditional American Protestant named for 3 presidents, President Arthur, President Garfield, and had the last name Hayes. But it turns out that, in fact, he's from a German Jewish family, as is the bottom person, Lewis Marshall, who is a lawyer from Syracuse, New York, who is, among other things, a founder of the American Jewish Committee and a fervent and active Zionist. But he is also the person who argues and wins an important race-related voting rights case in the 1920s called Nixon versus Herndon, in which the Supreme Court strikes down a Texas law that did not allow Black people to vote in the Democratic primary. The reason I put this group up, other than we're at Gratz College, and that in itself is part of the Gratz College history, is that when the civil rights movement begins in 1909, there is a growing amount of anti-Semitism in the United States, and the leaders of the Jewish community, which in many ways is this group of people, and certainly Jacob Schiff is about as important a leader as you can get. The leaders of the Jewish community fully understand that there's a very important connection between racial equality and all other kinds of equality. Or to put it another way, if you can discriminate against people on the basis of race, then you could discriminate against people on the basis of ethnicity or of religion or of national origin or of anything else. So from the very beginning, the civil rights movement in 1909 is one that is connected to an understanding that the denial of rights to one group of people easily slides in to the denial of rights to any other group of people. And so Lewis Marshall is the prime example of this. He is a litigator for Jewish causes, and he's a litigator for Black causes, and he argues a huge number of cases before the US Supreme Court. And he wouldn't see these as different causes. He would have seen them as the same causes. They are fundamentally about a human rights cause. Eventually, the leading attorney for the NAACP will become Thurgood Marshall, and we will see him in the next slide, as we saw him at the beginning of this presentation. We can go to the next slide. And Thurgood Marshall is sitting on the right. This is a very young Thurgood Marshall. In the middle is Walter Lee Irwin, who is appealing his death sentence. And next to him is a very, very young Columbia Law School graduate, Jack Greenberg. And Jack Greenberg goes to the NAACP right out of Columbia Law School. And eventually, when Marshall is appointed to the US Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, Greenberg replaces him as the head of litigation for the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. In other words, he replaces Marshall as the leader of the litigation arm of the civil rights movement. There's a Philadelphia connection for Marshall because he's a graduate of Lincoln University. He grew up in Baltimore, went to Lincoln University, then went back to Maryland, applied to go to the University of Maryland Law School, and was told that they would happily accept him except for the fact that he's Black and Black people can't go to the University of Maryland Law School. And so instead he went to Howard University. A few years after he graduated from Howard, he had the pleasure of litigating the case that integrates the University of Maryland Law School. The litigation strategy that Marshall develops, that Greenberg works with him on, is a strategy of attacking segregation by initially forcing Southern states to abide by the Supreme Court's rule that it was okay to have separate institutions as long as they were equal. The phrase was known as separate but equal. And what Marshall does is to say, okay, if you're going to provide a legal education for Black people, white people in Maryland, then you have to find a school for, you have to provide a school for Black people in Maryland. He wins that case. Maryland decides to just throw in the towel and allow the integration of Maryland Law School. In 1950, he litigates the case of Sweat v. Painter in Texas. Heman Sweat, a veteran and a postal worker, applies to Texas Law School. Again, the law school says, you're a perfectly fine applicant except that you're black, therefore we can't admit you. Sweat sues. Texas, being a rich and big state, immediately creates a black law school. And Marshall goes in and argues persuasively that while this is a separate law school, it is not equal to the University of Texas Law School. At the time, by the way, a graduate of Texas Law School sat on the US Supreme Court, Tom Clark. When this goes to the US Supreme Court, Clark will be sitting on the case. He will vote in the 9-0 majority to declare that the segregated law school is not equal to the University of Texas Law School, and therefore Texas Law School has to integrate. While Marshall is arguing Sweat, he's talking to the lawyers for the state of Texas, and he tells them, you know, you can set up a law school for black people, and if you win, you'll have won that. But our next plaintiff is going to want to get a degree in petroleum engineering. And are you ready to set up an entire engineering school because an African American in Texas wants to go and become an engineer? And of course, as he put it, this took the energy out of the Texas team because they realized, in a sense, that slavery was doomed. This becomes the litigation strategy, and the litigation strategy works. Eventually, segregated schools are declared unconstitutional. But in the streets, the litigation strategy is never fast enough. And now if we can go back to the very beginning of this presentation, the very first picture, going back through time to here. And this is where we get to Dr. King. Because of course, while Marshall is arguing in the courts as a great litigator, King becomes, quite by accident, not something he expected to do, the spokesperson for a boycott of the Montgomery bus system, which doesn't allow blacks to sit next to whites and has a weird system where blacks get on the bus from the back, whites get on the bus from the front, and gradually the seats fill up. But when it gets to the point where the last seat for whites is taken and another white person gets on the bus, that person simply goes to the end of the black section and moves a movable sign one seat back, and then the two blacks in that seat have to move to the back of the bus to make room for the whites. And so gradually the black people are pushed further and further back until the last two seats, two sets of seats, are only reserved for black people. So King becomes the spokesperson for the Montgomery bus boycott. And that becomes the beginning of the civil rights movement in the streets. And what we see in America from the 1950s through the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and beyond is the movement of people in the streets fighting and arguing and fighting for their rights, while in the courts, by this time, Marshall is on the Supreme Court, and people like Jack Greenberg and his colleagues are leading the fight in the courts. And it's a tandem effort. And without either side of it, we might still be in a position where we had a segregated society. I have run out of time. And part of the reason I've run out of time is because this is a topic that needs more than an hour, but I'm happy to stay on and take as many questions as people want to stay for. So Lori, I'm gonna turn it over to you and ask you to start feeding me some of the questions that have been coming in.
Of course I will, Paul. Thank you so much. I'm hoping we can extend this till 8:45 so that people can hang out just a little bit longer for the end of your presentation, and so we can get to some really good, juicy questions. So thank you for the presentation. It's been fascinating. And I know it helps me understand the slavery origins of some of what we are experiencing today. But before we do open up for questions, I'd like to remind alumni out there to don't forget to update your contact information on our website and join the Gratz Alumni Facebook page. We launched the Gratz at Home series back in April during a very challenging time, and we're thrilled to have received such a strong response and your continued support. Among those participating on the webinar tonight are alumni, current students, Gratz staff, faculty, members of our Board of Governors, and adult continuing education students. If you would like to help strengthen Gratz and make it possible for even more students across the world to participate in our online programs, please consider making a tax-deductible charitable donation. On behalf of everyone at Gratz, thank you for your participation and your support. And now we can get to the fun part and ask you some good, juicy questions. So as I have been looking in our chat going on here, I am seeing a few things. One thing is, I have a question from Zach Margolis. And Zach says, is it true that Lincoln proposed colonization of the Blacks?
Okay, so in 1816, an organization called the American Colonization Society was founded for the purpose of shipping Blacks back to Africa as a way of getting rid of the free Black population in the United States and encouraging some people to free their slaves. Now, of course, shipping them back to Africa is kind of an absurdity since, you know, probably by that time, 95% of all Blacks in America had been born in the United States. Their grandparents might have been born in the United States, their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents. So they weren't going back to their homeland. It had not been their homeland. They were Americans. Colonization fascinates many American leaders in the 19th century as a way of solving the racial problem. Lincoln in his early career supports colonization. And when he is president, he doesn't attack colonization, but he doesn't do anything very much to support it. The one thing that he does do is in the law to end slavery in the District of Columbia, the law provides $100,000 to help Black people move to Africa once they are free, if they would want to do so. However, that law requires that the president designate a place where they will go, be it Africa or somewhere else outside the United States. Lincoln never designates any place. So this might be the only time in American history when $100,000 is appropriated to give away to individuals who come forward to accept it, and not a single person comes forward to accept it. So colonization is never implemented. Other people argue that colonization is not a wholly crazy idea because, after all, much of the United States is made up of people who have come from other places. So why would it be so crazy for people in the United States to go to other places? But generally, most opponents of slavery see colonization not as something to help Black people, but rather as simply a racist plot to get rid of Blacks. However, in the 20th century, there are a number of Black colonization movements started by Blacks to have Blacks either move to Africa or to various places in the Caribbean.
Very interesting, thank you. I have another question that's coming in unrelated to that one. Says, should we mention that while Grant was busy defending the rights of the Blacks, he was rejecting Jews from the Army?
Well, that's simply not true. So we don't have to deal with it, whether he was doing it or not. What we do know is this, that in 1862, when Grant is the commander in the West, not yet the commander, not yet the supreme commander, Grant signs an order expelling Jews and others from his military district, which includes Kentucky, part of Tennessee, and part of Mississippi. Immediately, Jews in Paducah, Kentucky, who knew Lincoln, traveled to Washington to get an audience with Lincoln to have this order rescinded. Other Jews send the order to the War Department saying, how can you be doing this? The War Department does nothing because the War Department thinks this is a hoax. They think this is a Confederate fraud. They can't believe that any general would expel the Jews from the military district. A number of Jewish families are expelled, but the order isn't enforced very long, and it is immediately countermanded as soon as the actual copy of the order reaches Washington, and it's countermanded. Grant never explains why he gave the order. It's one of the mysteries of doing a biography of Grant. He never says anything about this one way or the other. Now, what do we know about the U.S. Army in the Civil War? There are 4 or 5 Jews who are generals. There are a number of other high-ranking Jewish officers. When Grant is president, he appoints a Jew to be the territorial governor of Washington. He appoints other Jews to office. Grant's, people sometimes say some of my best friends are Jewish, and it's always a remark from somebody who's probably anti-Semitic. Well, in fact, one of Grant's best friends is Jewish, a man named Seligman, who is, again, a very wealthy businessman, and he's Grant's favorite poker partner. So it's very hard to figure out what Grant is doing with this order. Some people have argued that Grant didn't even write the order, that it was written by his subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman, who's a singularly unpleasant human being from most descriptions of him. But I think Grant signed it. We can blame Grant for that. I wouldn't put an entire career on the basis of one stupid order, which is rescinded a couple of weeks afterwards. By the way, there's a very curious story about this, because when this order is implemented, a number of Jews go to their commanding officers and they ask if they have to leave. Can they go home? There's a regiment from Chicago that is mostly Jewish. There's a Pennsylvania regiment that has a high percentage of Jews in it. And so the Jews go to their commanding officer and say, well, I guess we have to go home, right? And the commanding officer says, no, doesn't apply to you. It's only to civilians. There's very little indication that Grant had a bigoted bone in his body. There's every indication that he signed an incredibly stupid order, and one that is not defensible. But he didn't refuse to have Jewish soldiers. On the contrary, he has them, and he has Jewish officers, and he has Jewish generals.
There's a bunch of comments going on right now about this right now, what you're talking about going on in the chat, and we're getting that Grant issued the order in an effort to reduce Union military corruption and stop an illicit trade of Southern cotton, which Grant thought was being run mostly by Jews and other unprincipled traders. I know you probably have a lot to say about that. We do have other questions going on here.
No, the order is about the illegal trade of cotton. And no one has done a really good study of this, but I do know that in the East Coast, there seem to have been a fair number of Jewish business families that have families in Richmond, have families in Baltimore, which is very much a pro-Southern city, even though it's in the United States, and families in Philadelphia. And they're trading back and forth during the war. So it may be that if you did an empirical study, you might discover that there are disproportionately more Jews in the illegal cotton trade than non-Jews, but they certainly wouldn't have been important because there aren't that many Jews in the area. Nevertheless, even if that were true, he doesn't single out any other group. And that's what makes it anti-Semitic. That's what makes it a stain on the history of the United States and a stain on Grant's career.
Yeah.
Next question.
Sure. So I think we're running into the end of time. I'm going to try one more question unrelated to that. After the Emancipation Proclamation, why did some non-Confederate border states, like Maryland, for example, keep their slaves 6 months longer than Confederate states?
Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation is an interesting legal document. When Lincoln becomes president, he tells the South, come back to the Union. You don't have anything to worry about. He says, I have no power to touch slavery where it exists. And that's technically true. That's constitutionally true. Can't end slavery in the States. But when the war begins, everything changes. And Lincoln discovers and asserts very early on in his administration that he does have the power to end slavery in the rebellious states because they have opted out of the Constitution. So the Emancipation Proclamation is, by the limits of constitutional law, only directed at those states that are in the Confederacy. There are 11 Confederate states. There are 15 slave states. So Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky are not in the Confederacy. Therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation cannot affect them. In addition, when the proclamation is issued, parts of Louisiana, parts of Virginia are already back under US control, and therefore they're not in the Confederacy anymore. So if the Emancipation Proclamation is a very detailed presidential proclamation, which says excluding the following counties. In addition, for political reasons, which had little to do with the reality of the war on the ground, Lincoln exempts the entire state of Tennessee, saying Tennessee is really back in the Union, which was nonsense. There would be numerous bloody battles in Tennessee. So at the end of the war, slavery is over in all of the former Confederate states, except perhaps Tennessee and parts of Louisiana and Virginia. But it would not be over in Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri under the Emancipation Proclamation. However, during the war, Maryland and Missouri end slavery on their own. But Kentucky, Lincoln's home state, refuses to end slavery, as does Delaware, which makes no sense because there were, under 2,000 slaves in Delaware at the time. But Delaware and Kentucky are the last holdouts, and they keep slavery until the 13th Amendment is ratified in December 1865, and then slavery is over everywhere. I'm willing to stay another minute or two if there's one or two more pressing questions, but I know people may have to go.
Yeah, I think they may. But you know what? It's been a pleasure. And there are all kinds of comments here thanking you for a terrific job that you've done.
Thank you.
In fact, I think there was at least one that said they're ready for your next presentation and trying to find what there was even an idea for what that presentation should be. I'll have to check that out. Racism, especially in Philadelphia. They didn't know about Tulsa or redlining until recently, and would love to know more about Philadelphia racism since the 1950s. So we'll put that on your list.
Philadelphia is a city that claims to be in favor of brotherly love. It's a very complicated history and not always very pretty.
Agreed. Understood. Well, we're going to be wrapping up, and I want to invite everyone who's participating right now. Thank you for inviting Gratz into your living rooms and your offices, your dining rooms, your dens tonight. And I would also like to extend very grateful thank you to you, Dr. Finkelman, for shedding some light on this often misunderstood part of our history. So thank you.
It's
Thank
been a delight. Thank you very much.
you. And good night, everyone.
Good night.